Have you ever wondered how far someone would go to protect a legacy that was never truly theirs to begin with? In the world of Formula One, speed is everything. Decisions are measured in milliseconds, and reputations are built or shattered before the next corner. I've spent my life in that world. I know what it means to fight for every inch, every second, every ounce of respect. But nothing on the racetrack ever prepared me for what I faced off it. My name is Max Verstappen, former world champion, son, husband, and, until recently, public disgrace. They said I lost my edge, that I cracked under pressure, that I retired, because I couldn't handle it anymore. But that was only the story they wanted you to believe. The truth is, someone tried to erase me, quietly, elegantly, with a glass of wine, a forced smile, and a whispered toast. What they didn't count on was that I was watching. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about control, reputation, and what happens when you refuse to play by someone else's script. If you've ever questioned the image a powerful family presents to the world, this story might change how you see everything. For most of my life, people only saw the helmet, the fireproof suit, the trophies, the champagne showers. To the world, I was Max Verstappen, the golden boy of Formula One, aggressive on track, clean cut off it, a legacy racer with reflexes like lightning and nerves of ice. I broke records before I turned 25, silenced critics with pole positions, and won 2 world championships before I could legally rent a car in some countries. But behind every roaring crowd and every newspaper headline, there was a quieter reality no one saw. I wasn't just racing cars. I was racing expectations, reputations, and the unspoken rules of a world that worships speed but fears disruption. After retiring at 31, too early for some, too late for others, I stepped out of the spotlight to breathe, to think, to finally decide who I was without the car. That's when I met Julia. She wasn't like the models or PR managers that usually floated around the paddock. She was sharp, composed, with a quiet intensity I admired immediately. What I didn't realize at the time was that Julia was the daughter of Lawrence Archer, chairman of Velocity Group, one of the most powerful entities behind the scenes in motorsports. To some, marrying Julia looked like the perfect post-racing fairy tale. To others, especially her father, it looked like an inconvenient wild card marrying his legacy. Archer was the kind of man who didn't need to speak loudly to command a room. His handshake was colder than any podium ice bucket, and his smile was the kind that rarely reached his eyes. He congratulated me at our wedding with the grace of a diplomat, but the warmth of a strategist calculating his next move. He didn't see me as a threat yet, but he didn't see me as worthy either. Not for his daughter, not for his empire. He never said it directly. Men like Archer don't insult, they imply. They offer opportunities that feel like traps. They ask questions that double as accusations. I tried to play the part. I attended the black tie galas, gave polite interviews, posed for sponsor photos, even after I'd stepped away from the track. I smiled through subtle jabs about retirement at your peak, and endured conversations where my driving achievements were framed as youthful flukes. Julia did her best to shield me from the worst of it. But even she couldn't deny how her father's tone shifted when he spoke about legacy. His, not ours. The more I tried to adapt, the clearer it became. Lawrence Archer didn't want a son-in-law. He wanted a pawn, a former champion who could be rebranded, repackaged, and positioned as a friendly face for the next generation of velocity-backed racers. Someone who would nod politely and stay quiet in boardrooms. That wasn't me. Then came the invitation. A private dinner in Monaco, with Archer's closest circle, sponsors, executives, former racers turned executives, an inner sanctum of motorsport power. Julia encouraged me to go. It's just dinner, she said. It's important to him. And part of me believed that if I showed up, if I smiled enough, maybe he'd finally see me as more than a trophy. Husband with a famous last name, but the knot in my stomach returned the moment we arrived. There was something too polished about the room, too rehearsed in the greetings. And then there was Clarissa, Archer's wife, who welcomed me with a smile that was somehow too warm, too eager. "I've made something special just for you," she whispered, handing me a drink. I smiled back, nodded, and thanked her. But inside I knew something was off. I've always trusted my instincts. On the track, they saved my life more than once. That night I decided to trust them again. And that decision, to switch glasses when no one was looking, would reveal more than just a sinister plan. It would unravel everything, their lies, their control, their legacy, because what they didn't know was that I had already stopped playing their game. If there's one thing I've learned from racing, it's that crashes never happen without warning signs. There's always a slight vibration before the tires give way, a whisper of instability in the corner, a flicker of resistance before the engine fails. You feel it in your bones, just like I felt something was wrong with the Archer family long before that dinner. After the Monaco evening, things between me and Lawrence Archer shifted in a way that was subtle, almost too quiet to notice. He didn't confront me. He didn't accuse me of anything. But suddenly I wasn't invited to the quarterly Velocity fundraisers. Sponsorship emails dried up. I was still publicly part of the family, but behind closed doors, I felt the walls tightening. Clarissa, his wife, continued to send messages that felt carefully written, almost diplomatic. Too many winks and hope you're well phrases to mean anything sincere. Julia, of course, noticed none of this. She believed her parents were difficult, yes, but dangerous, manipulative. That was hard for her to accept. She grew up believing in the myth of their success. Her mother, the poised society woman, and her father, the architect of modern motorsport, expansion. For her, their flaws were like hairline cracks in marble, visible only if you stared long enough. But I was starting to see the fracture lines forming a pattern. I tried to dismiss it, focused on building a mentorship program for underprivileged youth interested in motorsport. I partnered with grassroots karting teams, gave free workshops, and brought in former engineers to train new mechanics. It gave me purpose again, something outside the shadow of my own racing legacy, but apparently that purpose didn't fit into the Archer family's long-term vision. Lawrence invited us to a formal weekend gathering at their estate in Geneva. "Just family and friends," he said. "No cameras, no press." But when we arrived, there were nearly 30 people in tuxedos and evening gowns, and half of them were board members from Velocity or its affiliates. It wasn't a dinner, it was a demonstration, a show of power. Throughout the evening, Lawrence floated from group to group like a monarch surveying his court. Every conversation I joined, he found a way to redirect. When I spoke about the mentorship program, he'd interrupt with a well-placed joke. "Max always has a new project, man can't sit still, can he?" Laughter followed, thin smiles. Julia's hand tightened on mine under the table. At one point, I was speaking to a group of young drivers about pressure management, sharing my own story from the rain-soaked Belgium Grand Prix, the race that nearly ended my season and made my career. Lawrence cut in mid-sentence with, "Max is great with stories. You know, once he even convinced a team principal not to fire him after 2 DNFs in a row. Charming, really." It wasn't a compliment. It was a veiled reminder of power, of hierarchy. Later that night, as I was about to call it an evening, Clarissa approached. She wore a red silk dress and a practiced smile. "You didn't try the sangria," she said. "It's our signature recipe." I raised an eyebrow. "Your special cocktail?" "Only for our most cherished guests," she said lightly. "I saved one just for you." My stomach tightened. Her tone, her expression, it felt too scripted, too eager. I took the glass, nodded, and thanked her. But my fingers were already moving behind my back, switching the drink with a near-identical one I had picked up earlier from the bar. What followed confirmed every instinct I'd ignored. Within the hour, one of Archer's closest allies, an aging sponsor rep who had once told me, "Your days are numbered, Max," collapsed mid-conversation, pale and sweating. The room fell silent. Clarissa's eyes darted to me, her face drained of color. Julia rushed to help and Lawrence barked for someone to call a medic. But I stood there still, holding the original glass Clarissa had handed me, untouched and slightly trembling in my fingers. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to, because in that moment they knew what I knew, and what came next would not be a public scandal. It would be something far worse for people like them. Exposure. Slowly, strategically, and with surgical precision. When the ambulance finally pulled away from the estate, leaving behind a string of shaken guests and a trail of nervous whispers, the atmosphere at the Archer gathering shifted into something eerily quiet. No one dared ask the question out loud, but it hung in the air like engine smoke after a crash. What exactly had happened to Henry Crane, the longtime Velocity executive who had just collapsed mid-toast? Some mumbled about a bad oyster. Others whispered it might have been heat exhaustion. But I watched Clarissa. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her bracelet. Her eyes kept glancing toward the glass I never drank from. And she avoided mine completely. I slipped away as soon as the crowd turned its attention to the arriving paramedics. Quietly, I walked out to the back of the estate where the catering team was packing up. No one noticed as I sealed the untouched drink in a to-go espresso bottle I carried in my inside jacket pocket, an old habit from traveling light in pit lanes. I didn't say anything to Julia. Not yet. She was overwhelmed, trying to comfort her mother and calm the confusion, and I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. Back at our apartment in Monaco the next day, I contacted someone I trusted from my racing days, a man named Dr. Kieran Zhao, a former F1 medical consultant who now ran a private analytical lab out of Zurich. He'd tested everything, from fuel additives to illegal supplements for the FIA in his time. When I told him I needed a full toxicology analysis on a liquid sample, he didn't ask questions, just gave me a courier address and said he'd have results in 72 hours. Those 3 days were the longest I'd lived since the day I crashed at Silverstone in 2021. Julia, meanwhile, was trying to make sense of the aftermath. She said Henry had been stabilized at the hospital, that doctors suspected a bad mix of wine and prescription medication. But when I asked if anyone had tested the wine Clarissa served, she paused. Why would they? She asked, and I didn't have an answer I could give her without blowing everything open. Kieran called exactly 73 hours later. His voice was calm but clipped. Benzodiazepines. Not fatal, but high enough to sedate a grown man for hours. If he had underlying heart or liver issues, it could have gone a lot worse. There was a pause. Where did you get this sample, Max? I stared at the floor. Let's call it a domestic misunderstanding. I sat with that answer for a long time. The drink had been drugged, not by accident, not by coincidence. The dose was too calculated, too clean. This wasn't someone slipping a sleeping pill into a glass out of carelessness. This was deliberate. The deeper I thought, the more the questions spread like cracks in a windshield. Why would Clarissa drug me? Why Henry? Was it a mistake, or did someone else become collateral damage in a plan that wasn't meant for him? And why would they try to sideline me at all? I was already out of racing. I posed no threat unless they saw something I hadn't yet seen in myself. That night, I went through my files. Old contracts, partnership agreements, NDA clauses from Velocity's various sponsorship arms, and buried in the language of one dormant contract, a clause about intellectual property ownership, I saw it. A loophole that would have allowed them to claim partial control over my driver mentorship program if I had signed on under the Velocity umbrella, which Archer had tried to convince me to do 2 months earlier. I had refused, politely but firmly. And just like that, the picture began to form. I wasn't just an ex-driver. I was an obstacle. Someone with influence, with integrity, and with no strings left for them to pull. The kind of person families, like the Archers, see as dangerous. I had something they couldn't control, my name, my following, my independence. And now I had something else, evidence. But as I stared at the toxicology report printed in front of me, one thought repeated itself like a drumbeat in my head. If they were willing to go this far in private, what else had they already done in the shadows? The moment I held that toxicology report in my hands, everything clicked. Not in a dramatic cinematic sense, but like the cold, calculated hum of an engine firing up before a storm. Clarissa hadn't just made a bad choice in a moment of desperation. This was a move made by someone who had done it before. Someone who knew exactly how much was just enough to cause damage without raising alarms. And Henry Crane's sudden collapse wasn't an accident. It was a misfire. I was the intended target. The fact that he drank my glass was the only reason I was still standing, but the deeper I looked, the more disturbing the picture became. I knew I couldn't go to the press yet, not without undeniable evidence and a context that would make it impossible for them to spin it. So I started quietly digging. And in the F1 world, digging means two things: follow the money and check the medical records. It wasn't easy. The Archer family's influence reached deep, into contracts, hospitals, even media circles. But I wasn't the rookie they remembered. I had friends across circuits, people who owed me favors, people who had been cast aside for asking too many questions. One of them was Sophia Russo, a brilliant engineer who had worked for a Velocity-backed development team 3 years prior. She had left suddenly, no explanation. I reached out. Her response was instant. "Max, I was waiting for this call. We met in a quiet cafe just outside Milan." Sophia didn't waste time. "They did this to my partner. He was a young driver. Brilliant, hungry, too independent. Just like you. When he refused to sign with Velocity for exclusive representation, they ran him into the ground. Literally. One failed drug test, then a psychological evaluation that labeled him unstable. He lost his seat within 3 weeks." Her eyes hardened. "He wasn't unstable, Max. He was drugged." She slid a flash drive across the table. "I kept everything. I tried to go public once, but no one would touch the story. The Archers made sure of that." Later that night, I opened the files. Internal emails, incident reports, heavily redacted, medical summaries, all pointing to a systematic effort to control promising drivers who resisted Velocity's grip. What they couldn't own, they erased. Not with threats or lawsuits, but with carefully orchestrated ruin. And that's when I saw the name that made my blood run cold. Dr. Jean Lacroix, the same F1-aligned physician who had handled my health clearance before my so-called burnout retirement. He'd cleared me for racing 2 months before, then suddenly reversed his opinion after a single consultation. No lab tests, no scans. Just a subjective mental exhaustion diagnosis that became the final nail in my professional coffin. It wasn't a coincidence I wasn't burned out. I was targeted. I pulled every file I had from that period, travel schedules, meal logs, supplements, everything. I found a pattern: mild dizziness, insomnia, short-term memory blips, subtle but real, and then it hit me. What if I'd been drugged too? Just low enough to doubt myself, to question my own instincts, to believe I had lost my edge. Because once that seed is planted in a driver's mind, the game is already over. I returned to Kieran's lab and gave him samples of hair, old blood work. From my final season, even the energy drinks I had left in storage. 2 weeks later, the results confirmed my suspicion. Traces of benzodiazepines, low dose, consistent over weeks, untraceable by standard checks. Enough to subtly erode confidence, focus, and perception. Not enough to cause scandal, just enough to make me walk away willingly. It wasn't a burnout. It was sabotage. Orchestrated by the very people who toasted my retirement with practiced smiles, and now I had proof. Not just of the drink in Monaco, but of a long-term campaign. They didn't just try to silence me, they rewrote my story. But what they didn't realize was that I still had the pen. I thought I had already uncovered the worst of it. But the truth was, I'd only scraped the surface. What began as a single drink in Monaco was now unraveling into something far more calculated. An entire playbook of manipulation designed to protect a brand, a legacy, and a reputation built on control. Clarissa and Lawrence Archer weren't just overbearing parents or possessive power players. They were orchestrators, architects of ruin disguised as polished benefactors of the sport, and they had done it before. Just days after Kieran confirmed I had been sedated over time, Sophia reached out again. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of memory. "There's someone else," she said. "Someone you need to talk to." His name was Pascal Neuville, a once promising French driver who had been dropped from the Velocity-backed Horizon Academy 5 years ago. He had vanished from the circuit after a promising debut season, his fall chalked up to mental fragility and an inability to cope with pressure. "Sound familiar?" I flew to Marseille to find him. He answered, the door barefoot, eyes wary, movement slow. "I didn't think anyone would ever ask about that year again," he said. We sat in silence for a long moment before he pulled out a dusty folder from beneath a couch cushion. Inside were training logs, internal reports, and a journal, and a day-by-day account of how his reaction started to slow, how he doubted himself more and more until he lost all confidence behind the wheel. "They told me I was burned out," he said, "but I was only 20. You don't burn out at 20. He, too, had been under Dr. Lacroix's care, and like me had experienced unexplained symptoms that were never investigated. The pattern was unmistakable. Promising talents who refused to submit to Velocity's long-term plans were discredited, disoriented, and discarded. And then came the name that nearly stopped my breath: Thomas Darrow. I hadn't heard his name in years. He had been Julia's fiancé before she met me. The perfect candidate, Oxford-educated, clean-cut, rising star in F1's legal governance circle. But just a year before I came into Julia's life, Thomas disappeared from the motorsport world entirely. Publicly, the breakup was mutual. Privately, no one ever spoke of it. Sophia, once again, was the one to dig deeper. She traced an old employment record and found that Thomas had filed an internal complaint against the Archer family's influence over driver contracts. Weeks later, he was accused of corporate espionage, blacklisted from F1 affiliates, and, according to private records, entered into a psychiatric rehabilitation program. It was too much to be a coincidence. I didn't want to believe it. But something in my gut told me the Archers had done to Thomas what they nearly did to me. Not to protect Julia, but to control who was allowed into her life. Thomas had been erased, and I had been next. By now, I had more than enough to go public. But I knew it wouldn't be enough to just speak. I needed to show. People don't believe whispers, they believe stories, they believe evidence, and most importantly, they believe patterns. So I began building the case. I compiled everything: the toxicology reports, old email chains between Clarissa and Velocity legal advisors, Sophia's documentation, Pascal's records, and an anonymous testimonial from Thomas himself, who finally agreed to speak after I told him what had happened to me. I organized it all onto a secured drive, but I didn't just want to drop it into the public sphere and hope for the best. I wanted them to see it, to watch every piece fall into place, knowing that their empire, built on silence and intimidation, was now being disassembled with methodical, surgical precision. So I planned one last dinner. This time it would be at my table, and every seat would come with a front row view of the truth. The invitation was simple, polite, elegant. Dinner at our place, just family, Saturday, 7 p.m. Julia helped with the wording. She still didn't know everything, but she knew enough. She had sensed the shift in me these past few weeks. I wasn't angry. I wasn't panicked. I was quiet, focused. And she knew that for someone like me, silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. I made sure every detail was perfect. The lighting was soft, the table set for 6. Julia, Lawrence, Clarissa, Sophia, and Owen, Julia's younger brother, newly returned from working in Singapore. He was the wild card, smart, loyal to his family, but far more observant than he let on. I wanted him there, not just as a witness, but as someone who might still have the capacity to choose truth over comfort. When they arrived, Lawrence shook my hand with his usual icy grace. Clarissa kissed my cheek a little too tightly. Sophia played her part perfectly, polite but distant, her face unreadable. Julia floated between them, her expression carefully composed. We ate in silence for the first course. Pleasant conversation. A few toasts. Lawrence spoke of upcoming investments. Clarissa complimented Julia's dress. But beneath the surface I could feel it, The tension, the quiet before the lights flicker on and the masks fall away. When the plates were cleared, I stood. "There's something I want to share with you all," I said, walking to the media console. I connected my laptop to the television. The screen blinked on and the first video played, a familiar one. From the Archer estate in Monaco. Clarissa in her red dress carefully stirring a drink, adding something from a small vial. Her eyes, scanning the room before she carried the glass to the guest who would later collapse. Clarissa froze. Lawrence's jaw tightened. "What is this?" he asked too calmly. I let the footage play. The next clip was from the hospital hallway, Henry Crane being wheeled out, unconscious. Overlaid audio from Dr. Zhao's lab confirmed the presence of benzodiazepines in the drink. I moved through the evidence. Sophia's files on manipulated driver contracts, Pascal's interview, excerpts from Thomas Darrow's testimonial. At every step, I spoke calmly, precisely. No theatrics, no anger, just truth. Clarissa's voice broke first. "You've twisted this. You don't understand the pressure we're under. Sometimes people like you need guidance." Lawrence didn't speak. He just watched. His eyes weren't cold anymore. They were calculating, measuring the damage, assessing what could be salvaged. "You think you can destroy us with this?" he finally said. I shook my head. "I don't want to destroy you, Lawrence. I want you to face what you've done. I want Julia to see it. I want Owen to know. I want the people you've silenced to speak again. That's not destruction. That's correction." Julia turned to her mother. Her voice was low but steady. "Did you drug Max?" Clarissa didn't answer. Julia's voice rose. "Did you do to him what you did to Thomas?" Still nothing. Sophia stepped in. "They won't admit it, they never do, but they left fingerprints on everything. And this time, they underestimated who they were dealing with." Lawrence's calm slipped. "This will destroy your reputation. Max, if you release this, people will say you're vindictive, obsessed, unstable." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe they'll say I did what no one else had the courage to. Maybe they'll see that the real sickness in this sport isn't burnout, it's silence." Owen, who had said nothing until now, looked at his father. "Did you really sabotage Thomas? Were all those things you said about him lies?" Lawrence looked at him, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear behind his arrogance. The fear of losing his son. The fear of being exposed, not just to the world, but to the very people he once controlled. That night, I didn't ask for apologies. I didn't need them. I wasn't there to be forgiven. I was there to be heard, and for the first time I knew they were finally listening. After the dinner ended, the apartment was silent in a way that felt heavier than usual. The kind of silence that settles after an emotional storm, where words become dangerous and glances carry meanings too layered to unpack in a single night. Julia didn't say much as she helped me clear the table. Her hands were steady, but her eyes, normally so bright, were distant, searching for something she wasn't yet ready to name. I didn't push. I knew what she was processing couldn't be rushed. The next morning she was gone before I woke up. A short note on the counter said she needed time to think. No accusations, no defense, just space. I understood, but it still hurt. For the next 2 weeks I moved through life like a man in exile, not from a place but from certainty. I buried myself in work, restructuring my mentorship program, setting up an anonymous submission system for young drivers, to report manipulation without fear. I stayed busy because stillness brought thoughts. Thoughts like, had I done the right thing? Had I lost Julia to the truth she wasn't ready to face? She visited her parents once during that time. Stayed. Overnight. When she returned, she didn't call me, didn't message. I told myself not to read into it, but I did. Every hour of silence felt like the long wait between pit wall radio calls, those stretches where you don't know if the team is strategizing or if you're just driving blind. Then, one evening, a letter arrived. No envelope, no return address. Just a folded piece of cream stationery left under my apartment door. The handwriting was Owen's. You were right. It was only 3 words, but they hit me harder than anything I'd read in years. Beneath the note was a small USB drive. I plugged it in immediately. It was security footage. Again. But this time, not from Monaco. It was from the Geneva estate. Private camera feeds I hadn't known existed. The footage was grainy but clear, enough. One clip showed Lawrence and Clarissa in their study the day after our confrontation. Voices raised. "He's ruined everything," Clarissa hissed. Lawrence replied, "We should have gotten rid of him when we had the chance. Like we did with Thomas. I warned you not to underestimate him. I didn't think he'd fight back this hard." Owen must have copied the footage before they could erase it. He hadn't said a word at the dinner, but clearly he'd been listening, and more importantly, he had decided where he stood. That same night, Julia came home. Her face was pale, and there was a tiredness behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. She walked into my studio and sat down on the edge of the couch where I'd spent the last several nights. "I watched the footage," she said quietly. "I asked Owen if it was real. He said yes. I didn't speak. I let the silence carry the weight. They did the same thing to Thomas," she continued. "They made me think he was unstable, that he was obsessed with power, with proving himself, but they were the ones pulling the strings. I'm sorry," I said. And I meant it, not for exposing the truth, but for how much it hurt her to see it. Julia looked at me then, eyes brimming with a sadness I couldn't fix. I needed to believe they were good people who just made mistakes, that they didn't mean to hurt anyone. But they did, didn't they? I nodded. She took a deep breath. "I don't know if I can forgive them. Not yet. But I believe you. And I'm sorry I ever doubted you." I didn't need her apology. I just needed her to come back. She reached for my hand. And in that simple gesture, I felt the weight of everything we'd both been through. Not just as individuals, but as partners standing on the edge of something fragile and choosing to fight for it anyway. Trust, once broken, doesn't snap back. It's rebuilt inch by inch, lap by lap over time, and we were just beginning our next race. There's a moment in every race, usually around the final lap, when everything sharpens. The crowd fades. The engine noise becomes rhythm. You stop, reacting, and start sensing. You don't just drive the track, you become it. That's how I felt the day I decided to go public. Not with a press release. Not with a lawsuit or a scandal-fueled exclusive. I chose something more deliberate, more controlled. I called it a documentary screening. Legacy, behind the helmet. An intimate media event at a private screening room in Monte Carlo where journalists, sponsors, retired drivers, and a few rising talents were invited to see the unseen cost of greatness. No one knew what was coming, not even most of my team. Only Julia, Owen, Sophia, and Kieran sat in the front row, knowing exactly what. This was, as the lights dimmed, the screen lit up, not with images of racing glory, but with something raw. Quiet footage. Testimonies. My own voice narrating not a victory lap but the unraveling of a system. From Pascal's fall to Sophia's exile. From the footage of Clarissa's hand dropping something in my drink to Lawrence's whispered threat. To sabotage me like the others. Every second on screen was a stone in the foundation I was tearing down. I didn't speak after the film ended. I let the silence hang. Then I stood at the front of the room and said only this. "Now you know. The story you were never supposed to hear." The response wasn't explosive, it was eerie, still, like the aftermath of a crash you could see coming, but couldn't stop. Some sponsors left the room without a word. Others shook my hand quietly. A few younger drivers came up to thank me, whispering that they had felt something was off but never had the words, or the courage, to say so. Within 48 hours, everything shifted. Major F1 outlets picked up the story. The documentary was streamed, globally within a week, translated into 12 languages. FIA launched an internal review. Whistleblowers came forward. Old stories once buried under NDAs and threats began to surface again. And Velocity Group? Their silence was deafening. Clarissa vanished from the public eye. Lawrence issued a carefully worded statement about stepping down to make room for the next generation of leadership. But he didn't apologize. He never would. Men like him don't bow, they retreat. Yet the damage was done, not by vengeance, but by exposure. Truth isn't always loud, but when wielded with clarity, it cuts deeper than any scandal ever could. Julia stood by me through it all. She gave no interviews, made no public statements, but her presence beside me at every event, her hand firmly clasped around mine, that was its own kind of statement. A quiet defiance. A declaration that she had chosen her own truth, even if it meant tearing down the house she was raised in. Weeks later, we were invited to speak at the Global Motorsports Ethics Forum in Geneva. It was surreal, standing on a stage not to talk about lap times or podiums, but about psychological manipulation, legacy abuse, and the courage it takes to walk away from power when it comes at the cost of people's lives. I shared the final slide myself, a simple message on a black screen. You don't need to crash to know the track is dangerous. Sometimes walking away is the bravest lap of all. It wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about repair. And not just for me. A new set of transparency regulations was proposed within the F1 system. Driver wellness protocols were updated. Confidential reporting systems were implemented across feeder academies. They weren't seismic shifts, but they were real, measurable, the beginning of something better. And in that quiet ripple of change, I felt something deeper than victory. Justice. Not loud, but lasting. It's strange how justice rarely arrives with fanfare. There's no checkered flag, no glittering podium, no anthem playing in the background. Real justice comes in quiet waves, an email confirming a policy change, a young driver speaking out without fear, a message from someone who says, "Because of your story, I didn't quit." That's what the aftermath felt like. Not a victory, lap, but something steadier, something earned. In the months that followed the documentary's release, the world of motorsport began to shift, not dramatically, but deliberately. The FIA launched an independent ethics council for team owners and sponsors. The new driver autonomy protocol gave racers the right to refuse certain sponsorship arrangements or medical evaluations without penalty. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And that was more than I ever thought we'd get. I wasn't racing anymore, not officially, but I was still in the game. I founded the Trackline Foundation, a nonprofit to support young drivers, engineers, and staff who experienced abuse, manipulation, or corruption in elite racing. Sophia took on a leadership role. Owen helped handle legal vetting and compliance. Even Pascal came aboard as a mentor for drivers dealing with confidence loss or burnout. Real burnout, not the kind manufactured by a family boardroom. As for Julia and me, we didn't go back to normal. We built something new, something honest. We moved out of the Monaco apartment and bought a quieter home near Lake Como. Slower mornings, longer dinners, fewer questions with too many answers. She left her role on the Velocity Foundation board and started her own initiative focused on ethics in sports governance. She said she didn't want to just repair the damage her parents had done. She wanted to prevent it from happening again. We didn't talk much about Lawrence and Clarissa after that. Occasionally, news of them would filter through. Clarissa, spotted at a spa retreat in the Alps. Lawrence consulting for some obscure startup. They stayed out of the public eye, which was likely part of a carefully negotiated agreement. I didn't care. I wasn't watching them anymore. The only contact came in the form of a single letter. No signature. Just a message typed on high-grade stationery. You did more damage than you know, but maybe that was the only way to change things. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. 6 months later, I stood at the launch of my foundation's new headquarters. The building had been renovated from an old karting facility I used to train at as a teenager. I gave a speech. Nothing rehearsed. Just my story. Honest. Raw. I ended it by telling the next generation of drivers something I wish someone had told me when I was 20. Protect your name. Protect your instincts. And never let someone convince you that silence is the price of belonging. That night, as Julia and I watched the sunset from the rooftop terrace, she reached over and rested her hand on mine. "Do you think they'll ever really change?" she asked. I looked out over the darkening lake, then back at her. No, I said, but they don't have to, because they don't run the race anymore. She smiled. And who does? We all do, I said. Now, the quiet hum of life around us felt more powerful than any roaring crowd. No sponsors, no lights, no pressure to perform. Just the peace of knowing that we had told the truth, that we had drawn a line, and that no matter how fast the world moved, we had found a way to stand still and hold our ground. In racing, it's not just about crossing the finish line, it's about how you drive every corner along the way. And for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving the circuit, I was rewriting it. Max Verstappen didn't defeat his enemies by fighting on their terms. He didn't scream. He didn't retaliate with fury. Instead, he chose the slower, quieter path, the one that demanded patience, restraint, and above all, clarity. He let the truth do the heavy lifting. This story isn't just about Formula One or legacy or power. It's about control, the kind that hides behind polished smiles and family reputations, the kind that gaslights, manipulates, and isolates under the illusion of tradition. Max's story shows us what happens when someone refuses to be silenced, when they turn doubt into action and pain into proof. His revenge was never about humiliation. It was about liberation, not just for himself, but for everyone trapped in systems built to keep the powerful untouchable. He didn't just challenge the people at the top. He exposed the system that kept them there. So here's a question for you. What would it take for you to speak out, even when it costs you everything? If this story moved you, leave a comment. Share your thoughts. And if you've ever faced something similar, silence, pressure, manipulation, we want to hear from you. Because sometimes telling your story is the first step toward reclaiming your voice.